What is it that actually gets people excited about this? What is the transformative technology behind this that's driving this mania? This isn't just crazy people throwing money at something stupid. There's actually a really profound idea behind it. And that's what's really interesting to me. So to help us deal with that, we're going to deal with ledgers. So ledgers are really sort of crucial to society. And this is a Sumerian tablet. It goes back, 7,000 years. And essentially, it's a ledger. This is the very earliest form of writing. And in those early days, there's records of people transferring bushels of hay and so forth. And it's really no coincidence that the very beginnings of civilization in Mesopotamia came at the same time as ledgers. And the reason for that is that ledgers allow us to keep track of our records. And those transfers of value become a foundation around which we can understand each other and reach agreements as to how to resolve problems together. So, interestingly, the very first name ever recorded in history was some guy called Kushim, who was an accountant. So it gives you a sense of how important it is. It's important because we have this problem of trust. And essentially, if we don't sort of trust each other, we have to grapple with this lack of understanding as to who we are and what we've come to agree upon. So essentially, we've had ledger keepers resolve this problem for us. If I don't trust how much you're worth, if I don't trust how much you've spent, whether you're up or down, we can't move forward. We can't enter into an agreement with each other. And essentially, we've had to rely on these centralized record keepers to do so. And this guy, this is Giovanni de' Medici, he figured out that if we could resolve this trust problem, this mistrust problem, by bringing what was then double entry bookkeeping that the Arabs had invented and putting it into banking, he could actually do something very powerful, and that is to change the structure of money. So until then, to resolve this sort of fundamental trust problem that's at the core of how we resolve all of our problems as a society, when it comes to money, we just had to rely on tokens, a piece of paper, a banknote, or a gold coin. But if we were going to use that as our money, we'd essentially have to rely on somebody else to transfer it if we were not meeting that person in face-to-face. So now this trust problem comes back again because I can't trust the courier of this source of value. And this is really a fundamental way in which we've thought about money. Ever since those early days, we've still thought of money as the physical thing. But it's really a way of keeping track of all of our transactions. Money is simply a record-keeping device for society's debts, the clearing of our debts. So the bankers came along and said, this is Giovanni de' Medici, he said, if I was just to debit my account, the account of a sort of importer in London, and then credit a merchant in Venice, I could magically create money that doesn't actually have to transfer on a one-to-one basis. So essentially, the banks became the intermediaries of the way in which we resolved this trust problem around the world, and now we could do international commerce for the first time. So it's really no surprise in many respects that at that moment, the Renaissance began. Industrial Revolution, the modern world, all of it was built upon banking. Banking enabled us to move funds around the world because it resolved a core trust problem. But it was a centralized trust model. Right? We relied on Medici to do this, just as we rely on banks to do it in our current financial system. And just as we rely upon it, as I'm going to talk to you about, all sorts of other centralized record keepers to resolve this trust problem that we have between us in how we transfer value. That every one of these separately siloed, centralized ledger keepers was resolving this problem that we had amongst ourselves, and we were relying on them to do so. But there was no visibility across all of them, and we had to trust their interpretation of what the values was. No one really knew what it was. And what this is something that I like to call the cost of trust. In this case, we can really talk about what the actual cost of this trust was in pretty big terms, right? We had however many trillions of dollars in wealth that was destroyed, hundreds of millions of jobs, and all of this incredible disruption and sort of political disarray that really emerged out of that crisis. So this is a massive cost of trust that we as a society are paying by relying on entities who essentially weren't producing a consensus view of what the world should look like that was in all of our interests. But it's not the only cost of trust. There's many other ways to think about what the cost of trust is when ledger keeping is centralized. And in this case, this is Nairobi, a slum in Nairobi. And somebody owns that home, the proud owner of that home. Obviously not one that perhaps you or I would sort of boldly show photos of and invite people around to, but it's theirs. It's their asset. There's no question about that amongst their peers. Where there is a question is whether or not the record-keeping function underneath that, the property deed, can be trusted. And it can't. All over the developing world, billions of people own assets that can't be proven because nobody trusts the registrar. In a place like this, you can slip $100 behind the back of the clerk's seat, and he or she will change the ledger to your brother's name, if you like, right? So if I'm a banker or a prospective buyer, and this guy comes along and shows me, here's my house, and I don't believe it. I don't trust that data. So your representation of your asset is flawed. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you a loan. And this is the core idea of Hernando de Soto, a really influential economist in my life, who essentially argued that this is where wealth comes from. The mystery of capital is that we can essentially build trusted records with each other and then borrow against that and build entire systems on this paper, on this record-keeping system. But when it breaks down, none of that possibility emerges. So the poor are condemned to this cycle because they can't leverage their assets. And it's not just their homes, it's their identities. There are billions of people who have no way to prove who they are, which means child trafficking becomes a problem, which means you can't have a bank account. There are 2.5 billion people in the world without bank accounts. All because the system, this expensive centralized system, doesn't trust the information that they are putting forward as to who they are. So again, think of that in human terms as a cost of trust, a massive global cost of trust.